Thank you for joining us on the Southwest Florida Business Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Hine, and today we're joined by three experts in the cybersecurity field. That said, they make it really easy to understand the impacts that ransomware attacks can have on your business. So in this episode, we dive into what ransomware attacks are, what the impacts are for your business, especially the unconsidered costs that go along with it. And then we also talk about a zero trust or a least trust approach and how you can apply that to your business to mitigate some of these risks. So we're joined by John Schlager and Lee Noriega, the CEO and COO of Inceptus. They're a local company here. And Sam Curry, the Chief Security Officer from Cybereason. Give this one a listen, and I think you're going to learn quite a bit about the risks that are out there, even the commoditization of selling your information and selling breached systems. I mean, there's some stuff that we talk about in here that I had no idea even existed. So if for no other reason than to open up your eyes to what's out there and what these guys are defending companies against, I'd say give this one a listen. So I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Appreciate it. And we're joined here by quite a few people that know quite a bit more about cybersecurity than I do. So I would like to hand this off to John. If you can kick this off, and if you guys can introduce yourselves, company you're with, what you do, and then we'll get rolling into some of the topics we got here today.
Okay. Sure. Hey, I'm John Schlager. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Inceptus. You know, we are a consultancy that actually does managed security services as well, you know, particularly around cybersecurity. So
cool.
And I'm Lee Noriega. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Inceptus, and ditto with John said.
Cool. Sam, you're up.
I'm Sam Curry. I'm the CSO for Cybereason and a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute, and looking forward to a fun chat.
Okay, awesome. Well, so a couple of things that we want to get into today are ransomware and the cost that takes, you know, the toll that takes on some businesses. And then also, I know we're calling it zero trust architecture. Sam, what are you calling it?
I'm fine with zero trust, but I think of it as least trust.
Okay.
I think of it as how do you remove trust? Because trust is necessary to do business, but it's also where the bad guys try to squeak in and take advantage of things.
Okay,
Right.
Got it. So we'll talk about the least trust infrastructure and how that's the best mitigation against some of these attacks. So if we could, who wants to kick this off in terms of the actual cost of ransomware and what impact that has on businesses? Who wants to take this first?
let's step back too. You know, some of our listeners might not know, you know, technically what is ransomware? You know, Sam, I think that'd be a great question for you. Exactly. What is ransomware, the evolution? Let's talk about that before we talk about impacts.
Sure. So ransomware is a class of attack or attacks where, for the most part, it's financially motivated. And by the most part, I mean like 99 point something. So someone out there has decided they're going to extract money from a victim. And there's really two major components to that. The first is, how do they deliver the ransomware to the places it has to be? So if you have a company and you have an IT stack, then they've effectively got to get this delivery mechanism to get the payload distributed everywhere for simultaneous detonation. And so there's an operation involved in how they find you. A lot of that's automated, and there's actually a whole ecosystem behind it. It's called ransomware as a service. It's like a supply chain, if you will. And then there's the delivering of the bombs and then the detonation of it. And usually there's a very short time frame because the idea is to put pressure on people. We actually did a survey and found most people were attacked on holidays and weekends, by the way. So just when you go home and you're having your maybe second glass of something before Christmas, or, you know, whatever the holiday you're celebrating is, and suddenly you get a call from your IT person saying, everything's down and we have to pay a huge amount of Bitcoin to someone. So I think of ransomware as a business model that is enabled by all the advances in cloud and computing tools and technology out there. Does that help to kick things off?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the other things, what we see with businesses where the confusion lies with ransomware is, one, they don't even know what cryptocurrency is. and then they have to go pay it on the dark web, and they don't know how to get to the dark web. So now they've got a multifaceted problem, and they're not really sure which direction. And a lot of times it stigmatizes businesses. They don't do anything for the first 6 or 7 hours trying to figure it out. And in a ransomware attack, time is your enemy. The faster you can remediate, the better off you're going to be. The longer it takes, the worse it's going to be.
Yeah, a lot of these attacks as well, dwell time has increased, for, prior to ransomware attacks now too. So they're doing a lot of actions on objectives or doing things within that environment before they even launch this ransomware. And I think that's something that's new that's happened over the last few years is, because of that simultaneous detonation, that Sam was talking about. And to have that happen, you have to infect people before you want to take that thing public. So, I think that's kind of been a prolific problem with us as well, too. So
absolutely.
So, by the way, the temptation is to think of the cost of ransomware as what's the ransom? Like, how much do I have to pay? And that's just a fraction of it, right? There's, and I would say, if you find yourself in a situation, first of all, you should prepare ahead of time. Now's the time to get ready for when you may get hit. So you have contingencies ready. Every second counts. As we said, time matters. But effectively, when it comes, if you just are paying to make it go away, it won't. There's not only are there regulations coming out requiring disclosure, and more laws are being passed around that. Many of these guys will go public with it, and somebody will wind up talking. It will get known. And my advice is to seriously think about crisis management, not just business continuity and disaster recovery, but how do you manage in the crisis the making of decisions? Who do you call? Right. Under what conditions would you or won't you pay? And my sincere advice is if you can avoid it, don't pay. Yep. Just like you wouldn't pay terrorists and you wouldn't pay hostage takers unless it was about human life or public safety. Really determine ahead of time, what would you or wouldn't you pay? And my advice is don't if you really don't have to.
That's interesting you say that, because one of the things that we're seeing in the last few years is that insurance companies have been paying out ransomware pretty easily. But just recently, they've really put their foot down and said, look, we're not going to do this anymore. You're crushing our business. We're not going to make any money as an insurance company. So we're not going to be paying out ransomware going forward. And we're hearing that message over and over throughout the insurance industry.
Are insurance companies now starting to look at businesses with, when they go to write these policies, and are they starting to actually look at their security stack, basically?
They're trying, but the problem is that insurance companies don't have enough actuary data to really make a great, this is how much your insurance is going to be. It's all subjective. It's conjecture. And so what's happening is the insurance companies are trying to get into this game, but they're still only limited by what they can find from a threat perspective because they're scanning the outside of the networks, and that's just giving them one score. They don't know what's going on behind the firewall.
Okay.
By the way, you're spot on. And there's real reasons. One reason I'd like to put out for that is the actuarial tables are really easy to understand for when nature's the enemy. Right. If you're talking about hurricanes and fire and what have you, but you'll notice that there's acts of God and acts of war usually have exemptions in most insurance policies, right? Or they're hideously expensive. But, there are, in effect, there are no hacks of God. But the truth of the matter is it's really hard to make actuarial tables with an intelligent, adapted enemy. Right. And I would emphasize, while all the attention when you read about ransomware is going to be on the tools, it's actually human beings. And so, it's incredibly difficult to figure out what the likelihood of a human finding their way through a defense and through a landscape inside of an organization. You could have all the right tools, you could be doing all the right things, and they can still find purchase. And so, if let's say you had a program for limiting fire at your business, you could get to 5 nines of efficiency in limiting fire. Fire doesn't get smarter, right? Unless you change the environment, you're going to stay at 5 nines. But if you got to 5 nines at stopping hackers and you left it alone, you would start to drop in efficiency because they're figuring out new ways, and you would come down very quickly, by the way. Yeah. 80, 70, 60, 50. And that's part of the challenge. We have active opponents innovating on offense just as we innovate on defense.
Yeah, and the adaptation from machine learning and all these types of, new tradecraft that's coming out. That stuff, like, what is it, dwell time or attack time now for the Russians? I think the best group is 19 minutes. They can get in, infect, lay Easter eggs, laterally move, and get out with the data in 19 minutes. And there's no human that could ever do that. So that's all, scripted machine learning and based on basic things, that we need to do to secure those environments, and that's kind of what's not been getting done. And that's kind of, why we want to talk about zero trust as well, because that methodology helps understand all those different, attack vectors that these guys are coming through to infect a machine, because there's so many, it's not just ransomware anymore that's coming through phishing. They're attacking command and control. They're loading key loggers. They have exploit kits that are there. They're monitoring your emails. If Office 365 still hasn't fixed MFA for, Outlook, for being able to grab your email with an Outlook client, you don't need MFA.
Yeah.
So credential harvesting is huge. That's how they're getting in, so whole huge.
Well, I think to expound on what you're saying too, I think what we're also seeing is that a lot of companies who feel that they're not a target are probably the biggest target for ransomware because, John and I have been looking at the threat landscape over the years, and what we're seeing is the targeted attacks have waned a little bit. They're still targeted. There's still attackers going after certain targets, but the opportunistic attacks have grown exponentially like crazy. And so a lot of people who don't think that they're a target or have anything, they're still getting targeted because it's a shotgun approach from the attacker's point of view.
So, in fact, it's all like spiders, right?
Yeah.
How does Google know where everything is? Well, they spider the internet very efficiently, very frequently.
Yeah.
You can do the exact same thing to spider for vulnerabilities. And so they know where certain business classes, industry, size of companies are on the internet. The internet's basically a number line. It's a very big number line, but you can go to specific segments and say, scan, find who's open, automate the exploitation. And on the backside, you talked about AI. The hackers have a screen with AI determining who's most likely to pay out, so they know where to send the human beings to follow up for that 19-minute exploit.
Sure.
So it is not about whether they're coming after you. It's whether or not when they throw the net out, you're in the net.
Right. That's a good analogy.
And you talk about the ransomware as a service, like you don't even have to be a skilled hacker, for this stuff. You can pay somebody. They'll take a percentage of the profits, 20%, whatever it is you negotiate. They have 24/7 response. You have dial-up numbers that you can call. They have better customer service than most companies do. So that's a little terrifying to think that. So it's making it easy for people because as my father always said, deprivation breeds motivation. And as these things are happening, now we have sanctions on Russia. We have all these war and everybody's freaking out a little bit. It leaves opportunity.
Sure.
So these guys are coming after everybody. And we're starting to see that now. We've literally since the Russian-Ukraine conflict, we've seen a huge uptick scanning from those addresses. They're known bad, but nobody's blocking them. They just scan at will. And being that we're open and free.
Yeah, just a few days ago, Our Evil came back.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Whether or not it was law enforcement theater back in January, or if it's the Suicide Squad, or maybe they're just going back into business, is immaterial. They're back on the scene. A highly successful gang. Yep. Resurrected, as it were. So,
Hydra. You cut one off, 5 more show up, and that's exactly what happens.
That's it.
I think the other thing to think about, too, with ransomware, a lot of viruses and malware, a lot of products and services depend on signature-based detection, knowing what it is. And I think the message here is that with ransomware, it's so easy to manipulate an existing piece of malware that changes that string, and it becomes undetectable at that point. You could change one little piece, one word in that document, and it changes the whole signature of that piece of malware there. So having tools that actually don't have to rely on signature-based detection is probably, and I can't understand why companies today aren't really investing in this, because you hear about these large ransomware attacks and they're running just an old version of an antivirus.
Right.
Yeah.
To be fair, our industry doesn't do a wonderful job to help people understand what's what. We all, in our industry, we all use about 40 words to describe radically different things. Yeah. But when you get down to it, the tests tell something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework helps enormously.
Sure.
And the magic word for me is behavioral. And I don't mean just hand wavy stuff. It's what are the sequences of actions that indicate malice. It's what is the on-system behavior. It's the applied machine learning, not like the talk of Skynet and HAL 9000 type stuff, but really down in the weeds. How's it helping you with a specific task? Applied machine learning applied to a task is where the value comes out in assisting the human beings in defense. And so I would emphasize, get ahead of the claims and understand. You don't have to be able to understand computing and how it works at a bits and bytes level, but you should be able to go down a level or two. Okay, it's machine learning. How is it learning? How is it applied? How does the benefit turn up for my business process? right? Honestly, stopping bad guys is a business process. Preventing malware from running a ransomware is a business process. And so knowing how the pieces fit together is important, even if you can unpack them and dig into the details.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a very interesting take, and it kind of almost goes back to the insurance piece where most people can think of it with you're dealing with nature. You can think of security in the physical sense of, well, we've got locks, we've got thumbprint scanners, we have the alarm system, but I've actually never thought of cybersecurity as an actual process. It's a business process. We actually do these steps, and by doing this, we're actually mitigating X risks because of this, X risks because of that.
You're absolutely right.
I guess, well, and I think that's probably a good segue into the zero trust or the least trust conversation. So you discussed some of the ways that these people are going in and actually getting into your system, doing the ransomware, and now you've got to pay it. What are some of the ways that you can actually set things up and get ahead of it and mitigate these risks?
Yeah, I mean, zero trust, let's just think of it this way. It's not a technology, which every vendor in the world will tell you that zero trust is a technology. It's more of a methodology in a way that you go about doing things. You know, we've changed names over the years. Defense in depth, you know, we've used. Everybody hates that term now, so they have to make up a new one, right? Or a new acronym to support whatever we're doing. You know, I guess it's the DoD lineage or whatever. You know, everybody likes acronyms, but you know, that's that process.
Well, the thing about defense in depth is it's usually been an excuse for when a vendor has failed. They're like, oh, we should have defense in depth. Which is like saying, you bought me to do this job. And when I failed to do it, it's not my fault. It's because you didn't put somebody else in here to do the job.
Right.
And so you wind up with 2, 3, 4x the cost for incremental 1.1, 1.2 times the effectiveness. DID done right should be the opposite, right? And the only way to do it is, in fact, with business processes. So what you say is, I care about efficiency. I care about effectiveness, and I can put metrics in place for that. How do I get more people able to do the job better at higher scale? And you flip it around and you say, well, how do the pieces work intelligently with each other? Or at least how do they fit in a logical way that reinforces one another? Instead of just, double bag it and triple bag it, because that doesn't work. Defense in depth, I think we need a new doctrinal term. There's intelligent defense in depth, and then there's very stupid defense in depth.
Right.
And you can do it with even relatively simple tools. But the focus on the business outcome, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's what we have to bring into the security discipline. And it's actually, by the way, the common language we could have with the business, because most of them think that we in security are just, I'm a CSO, right? Most CFOs think CSOs are hobbyists who just want to buy the toy of the week. They're like, how come you're not a responsible business process? When do I stop paying for the next acronym thing coming down the pipe, right? And the answer is, well, we have an adaptive opponent, so we should be treated as kind of like a weather report, or maybe more accurately, like you would deal with sales risks or how you would deal with legal risks, not how you deal with IT risks, where the enemy is usually nature, even though we came from IT.
Yeah, and I think going back to least trust methodology, I think one of the things that most companies don't realize is they can start working on that now at little to no cost. A lot of it is just, tightening what their users are able to get to, making sure that your data is secure in a folder maybe that nobody can get access to. Just little things that you can compound over time. You can't have a great security program overnight. It just doesn't work that way. It takes time from inception to where you want to go.
Sure.
So to the R&D and the IT side, trust equals business opportunity, more transactions, faster.
Yeah.
To security, it's more opportunities to be exploited, abused, used wrong. And if you don't want any risk, sure, go ahead, turn everything off. But that's not the point. And one of the things that really got me when zero trust was first being thrown around, not only that people were saying, you need to buy one or two of them, here's a product in a SKU, is that if you could jump to a perfect zero trust state, nothing would have an existing ability to connect with anything else. It would all be strongly authenticated and verified, and then continuously authenticated and verified. And then it would be destroyed as access, and then you'd have to be able to monitor it. And one of two things would happen. First of all, you'd shut down the entire business if you did it. And the second thing is you'd create potentially a new control plane that's just a new place to go and attack.
Right.
How is that just in time instantiated? So rather than this, leap to a perfect state of no trust, least trust says you're going to tune And you're going to start to remove unnecessary trust. And you're going to make sure that you don't overinvest, because you can spend a lot of money pursuing this. It's going to be optimal investment. And it means you're going to minimize so that the CIO is not wandering the halls with a knife trying to kill you. Hey, you shut something else down, right? No more of that, right?
Yeah. And, I think we need to take a step back too. Zero trust is a complex topic, to get back to. And most business owners are nowhere near ready for zero trust. They need to, half of them don't even know their true attack surface. Where is my data stored? Everybody has data everywhere now. Back in the day, we had built this castle. We had this file server that we protected. It was like a bastion. We would just defend it to death. Now it's completely different. Our data is disparate. It's everywhere, and most people don't know where it is. So I think that's a problem that we have with a lot of the companies that we deal with. They don't know where their data is at. So how can you protect something when you don't even know where it exists?
I would recommend don't buy a zero trust. Don't have a zero trust that we delivered on September whatever. Instead, have a program where you sit down and do a little workshop with some executives and say, what do we mean by trust? What do we mean by less trust? Why does that matter to the business? And then have a zero trust program, which says that we're going to every 3 to 6 months figure out how can we get less trust without disrupting the business. That's constructive. Then you invite vendors in and say, show me how you feed into my zero trust program.
Right. And that's something that I've seen too recently. I've actually just did a big workshop with a large healthcare organization, going through the same process, trying to figure out, what does this mean for their organization, how they could go about it, that type of thing. And from that reference model, they could start to instill, because this is going to take years to implement, especially in these massive organizations that have tons of different applications, multiple identity stores, all these trying to collapse and try to make that smaller. I mean, it's a huge problem, for organizations to try to stamp out zero trust in their organization. But taking that organized approach, like Sam is saying, is kind of the only way to eat that elephant, one bite at a time, So, starting with that attack surface, moving it in, I kind of came up with a methodology around this too. Trying to find out your identity stores. You need to have that application proxy that's going to be, your zero trust policy holder, essentially. There's lots of companies that are doing that type of stuff. And then, figuring out where that data is and, who wants to access it. So there's so many different steps to that. And a lot of organizations, they have identity access. Yeah, it's in Active Directory, and that pushes to everything else. But nobody has even sat down and really thought about how does it push to all these different things, And there's no way that we're really going to ever get rid of that, identity structure, when it comes to zero trust or just in general. I've seen all these new.
But zero trust is such a seductive phrase. Right? I mean, the word zero is like sharp, and trust is like, that's awesome. You put them together, and it pulls us in. If somebody does a webinar and says we're going to zero trust, you're like, I need to be part of that. But if you do this approach that you're talking about, you'll be prepared for when people start throwing that seductive term around. It will mean something concrete instead of everything. And I think it's super important to come up with a position on it before you click on anything, which you shouldn't probably do anyway, or sign up for anything where someone's pitching it as what they do.
It's interesting. Are there any measuring metrics or KPIs around zero trust so that you can actually, say here's where my baseline is, and then measure each of these different areas as I try to build onto
I've seen a ton of them, but none of them are authoritative.
Right.
And I've sat in a few workshops where people turn up ready to build an incredibly complex reference architecture. And I'm like, why are you doing that? Right. Not only is perfection the enemy of the good, and incremental improvements what we should aim for, everyone has come out of the woodwork to say, I know what it is. I've sat in a few academic bodies, a few standards bodies, and I'm always going, slow down. Why are you looking to actually, I'm going to go back to, do you guys remember NAC, way back, NAC NAP? Yeah. And I was at a show in 2006, and somebody in the audience was with a hospital in Scandinavia and stood up and said, well, I'm doing NAC. What should I do first? And I did not mean to put them on the spot. I was on a panel. I said, well, I have one question back for you first. Why are you doing it? And the person looked at me and said, well, it's NAC. And I'm like, that's not a business reason. Right. That is, at the time, that was Cisco, God bless Cisco, trying to sell more equipment with a wonderful set of features and to pile on some of that. And he had believed he needed NAC. Zero trust can easily go the same way. Yeah. If you don't know the business reasons you're doing it, don't do it. Now, if somebody comes out with a compelling reference architecture, great. But so far, the measurements, the metrics, nobody's coherent, And it seems to be a theoretical exercise for academic types at the moment.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I've sat through a lot of seminars about zero trust, and the messaging is so different across the different vendor sets and the different organizations that are trying to push it. It's not standardized. It's just what everybody's thinking.
It's a dessert topping. It's a floor wax.
It is. And every technology, like it goes back to, every one of them is for, Cisco, Tetration, Microsoft has their own model. Everybody's running in different directions. It's got to come back to somebody, some RFC has to be made to say, this is zero trust. This is what you have to follow. My whole life has been, that battle, syslog, why can't we just all say syslog in the same way? It would make life so much easier for security people, but they didn't, and I think that needs to really happen. Somebody's going to win, just like the car industry at the turn of the century. What were there, 2,000 car manufacturers? We have probably a couple dozen maybe now. So same thing has to happen with zero trust, but somebody's got to come out and say that this is how it's going to be done. This is the methodology we follow. Even the vernacular and the terminology is different. Microsoft, I actually like Microsoft's approach. I kind of follow that a lot, and how they broken out at different areas within zero trust identities, all those data stores, all those different areas, it's kind of nice how they did that. But till somebody comes up with it and says that, it's going to be really tough. It's going to be tough years.
You're right. But, there's a temptation as sort of technical types for us to say, well, there must be a truth. There must be a real thing we're all headed towards. And then when we get there, so can we just jump to that? And let me just say, there is no truth. How we do it will determine what it is or even if it is in the next 4 to 5 years. And there's two ways standards come out. This is the only Latin I'll use, I promise. The first way is de jure, right? Which means you direct it. It's like jurisprudence. It's the law. And so a group gets together. We did this with SAML, and like the Oasis gets together, or any number of working groups, and they say, let's all together figure out the protocol, the standard, the way to do it. That can happen. It takes a long time. It's highly political. And sometimes, like, say, SPML, apologies to any SPML fans, it fails miserably, right? But the other way is de facto, and you just alluded to this. That is, somebody's able to convince enough people to adopt it.
Right.
And it becomes the standard by virtue of that. And if they're good players, they open source it, they open it up, and they invite others in. But that takes time as well. And so until the politics shakes down, until the vendor supply system shakes down, until the adoption happens, we're going to sit around and wait for maybe a standards body to produce it. I'm all about pragmatism, though, rather than telling people how to do it. So otherwise, you get the academic types, they tell you how it goes, and maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't.
Well, I think there might be another demand that pushes it into standardization, but it may not happen just because if you remember back in the mid-90s and late 90s, vendor solutions didn't play well with each other. I mean, if you had a Cisco network, you couldn't put any other network gear in there, and same with other vendors. And the consumers finally put their foot down and said, no, I'm not buying a whole Cisco network. It's got to be standardized. And eventually it did happen. They came out with RFCs that standardized a lot of the protocols and a lot of the firewalls and devices. But today we're talking about a concept of zero trust. And I think it's not going to happen for a while because the consumers don't really understand zero trust yet. It's a buzzword. It's cliche, but it's not something that consumers are really looking to do right now.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think Gartner has this wonderful tool called the hype cycle. Which is this initial burst of enthusiasm and dreams, and that's when it peaks, and then it goes down into like the slough of disillusionment, like the actual bottom where y'all go, oh, that's awful, don't ever say it again, and then it becomes practical, right? And I think we're still mounting towards the peak on this one. There's a few buzzwords that float around our industry, and actually RSA conference is coming up relatively soon. It'll be interesting in post-COVID to see what words appear because we've had a couple of years of hiatus. But I always go around and say, what am I seeing? Like word counts. Oh, compliance 1 year. And then later, it was like,
AI, machine.
It was crypto and AI, and we had blockchain. So, I bet you zero trust is right at that top peak. And I'm interested to see what happens at the conference and after.
That's funny that you bring that. I guarantee you it is. It is going to be zero trust and AI. We do use artificial intelligence. It's like, no, you don't.
So on this, right? So it's interesting you bring up this hype cycle, and then it seems like some sort of trough of despair. And then after that, it's pretty much levels out and people can actually understand the core concepts and then start to actually apply the relevant.
And it quietly does the job. Yeah, it's happening.
So in this case, it seems like just from a business sense, right? What are some of the ways that people can go in and actually start figuring out what this is and how to implement? Because you both mentioned that, this is not something that the science is settled on or whatever it may be. This is seems like an evolving process where you really need to sit down with the executives at your company, the leadership at your company, find out what's important to them, educate them on the actual risks, and then it seems like a slow process of actually moving this towards an implementation and getting close to a quote perfect state. But what if you could give 3 things that you should start with in a meeting like that? What are the main 3 things that a business should focus on?
I would say the first is, what data do you have in your organization that is essential for the operation of your business? If it's financial records, if it's client information, intellectual property. A lot of companies don't even realize what data that they have, which is most important. And they try to protect all data the same. And so that gets a little convoluted too, because if you've got an email to grandma over here and you got the financial records from this last quarter, you can't treat them equally as the same documentation.
Got it. Okay.
But you also said risk,
Yeah.
right? And so rather than say, how do we do zero trust right? It's okay. Are you having the right risk discussions? And I'm going to emphasize, first of all, data. I totally agree on that one as number one, but I'd say you got to be having the right risk discussions with the business stakeholders, to which you then respond with tools. But if zero trust enters into the equation, you're not going to go buy one. You're not buying a zero trust, right? There's no SKU for it. There's no number for it. I still think it's a program. It is about paying attention to what's happening in the industry, to have advisors, to have partners who can come in and say, let's see how we address your risk, and let's see if zero trust is a good strategy for you, right? That it's not a how do you do zero trust. It's the same thing I said to that guy about NAC years ago. It's what are you trying to do business-wise, and that has to be a risk conversation.
I agree, but I think one of the things that I see is that when we talk about risk, what's the risk appetite of the C-suite that you're talking to? Because, if they don't feel that they have a problem, you've got a long road ahead of you to convince them that they do. And so risk appetites can be changed. They can, they can open their eyes and say, oh yeah, you're right. I get this now. But there's a lot of companies out there that they feel like that they're not a target. And, I don't even want to have this discussion right now.
Sure.
Well, one of the most useful discussions I ever had with a company that I was the CISO for was, I said, guys, you are taking cyber risk right now, unreasonable levels. We're in business to take risk, but we're not in business to take cyber risk. This was actually a business intelligence company. I said, we are supposed to be taking other forms of risk with our capital. I said, if you buy these tools and you set up this program, the risk comes down to an acceptable level and you can go invest in other things.
Right.
And that dialogue really helped, because they constantly would hear me say, well, I need a tool, I need this, I need a process, I need to hire a person. It's like we all do. And I said, guys, when I flipped it to be a risk conversation, I said, you're here to take risk. You're taking the wrong risk. Everybody understood what I meant.
They're used to building widgets. Risk is something that they understand too, and it's kind of tough. Like what were we told before we start this? Don't go into geek speak. Same thing with business owners. You can't start talking about technology and process and people when they're like, why should I care? And assigning that to a risk is huge. If you can figure out brand reputation, because these things affect your business. They don't just affect, your computer systems. Oh,
Sure.
It's down. It's brand reputation damage. It's downtime. It costs you money. It's all these new privacy laws. You could be out of business. What is it? Last statistic is like 65% of small businesses go out of business, after a cyber breach. That's kind of, what we try to avoid. Zero trust is a complex topic and those types of things, but everybody's already made, decisions for security controls within their organization. So, my best advice for everybody is tighten what you have, know that attack surface. You've already spent money. You've did it for some reason, probably not risk-based, but it was like, that tool to fit that. I have this need, I need a tool, that's kind of been the fix for, 10 years, 20 years now. Everybody wants the solution, that silver bullet, but it's not. So, like I said, keep just Viking rules, keep your house in order. Number one, that's kind of what it is. So
Sure.
Look at those things.
I think technology, though, is been a big game changer on how we detect and how we alert and how we mitigate and remediate. 10 years ago, John and I were running a security operations center, and all we could do was alert. We were like that commercial with the bank robber robbing the bank, and the lady says, "Aren't you going to do something?" He goes, "Oh, I'm just a bank monitor. I'm not a bank guard." And that was kind of us back then. But what we've seen through technology changes over the last 10 years is now these, like Cybereason, their devices are the decision points. They're doing the active stopping and blocking. So by the time that we're alerting, it's already been mitigated or remediated. And we're seeing that not just with endpoint controls, but we're seeing it with email. We're seeing it with all kinds of different technologies. And I think that's where a lot of the vendors are going to. I'll help you stop and block this stuff.
Got it. More than just standing by.
Yeah.
It has to. I mean, you can't be processing machine speed threats in human speed time.
Absolutely.
Right? You've got to be getting massive increases in efficiency and scale, and the only way to do that is if you are controlling and to some degree incrementally allowing more the ability to make decision. Now, in this case, it's another instance of trust. Right? Do I trust that this thing will stop the latest threat and not interrupt business more often than not?
Yeah.
And that's a big trade-off. In fact, it's a great thing to have conversation with partners and with vendors about how do you make this distinction between interrupting the business versus preventing something bad? And how do you break out of the seeming trade-offs, the seesaw between those two and maybe get it closer to continuous business and stopping the bad? People who can start to break that paradigm are the ones that ultimately will win.
Yeah, I think we're also still dealing with, what we used to deal with years ago. And people, when they saw a security guy walking in the door, they're going, "Oh, this guy's going to make my life harder. It's going to have to do 10 extra steps just to get to my email. And he's going to say I have to do this and that." But I think it's starting to change because people see it. They see it on the news. It's happening to their companies. It's happened to them personally. And so now they're standing up and taking notice.
Yeah.
I think people are getting numb to it as well, though. You know what I mean? Oh, he's had a ransomware attack. No, I think we see so many of them that now, too, it's becoming normal. So people are starting to bury their head in the sand again, like, oh, it's already affected everyone else. It's not going to affect me. And I think that's a big issue that we have, too. So.
Well, I guess just as we're kind of wrapping this up, to kind of touch on that point, I did have one experience in aviation, at least another company that was in aviation that got ransomwared a few times, and a lot of their customers even got ransomwared. And I never had thought of it, but as we're talking about this, the unthought of costs, right? It's not just to your point, it's not just pay for that data back and now you have it. It's, okay, how do I actually unencrypt that data? Who is going to do that? How do I get that back into my system? How do I get my system back up and running? How long was my system down for that impacted my current customers, and what impact did that have on my revenue? I mean, what are some of the main things that you guys would say people don't think about for these attacks and why they should actually try to prevent them?
I got to say, brand reputation, what John was talking about, is probably top of my list. It's one of the few factors that we can't really put a cost on. I mean, we can say it's going to cost this much per user or this much per record and have a fixed cost, and it's going to cost my lawyer fees this much, and it's going to cost this much to communicate to my clients and tell them I suffered a breach. And if there's a third-party liability, God knows what's going to happen. But from a brand recognition, I always use the Target example. When Target got breached a number of years ago and had a $70 million policy, the breach cost them $90 million to mitigate. And so they thought it was done. But over the next 3 years, Target lost 30% revenue share year over year. And that final cost came in a couple years ago at $450 million was the ultimate cost, which they could never forecast. They had no idea that their business would suffer that much from that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Something else to keep in mind is 81%, according to a survey we did last year, of those who've been hit get attacked again.
Yeah.
So now when you get hit, you don't get to say we're a victim. I know this is really hard for people to sort of grok, but if you are in the target and you have, no pun intended, but target, if you're in the sites and you get hit with ransomware, you now have to go through a terrible messaging phase and communications phase. And you have two options. You can look like a hero or a villain. You can look like, hey, we took actions to protect your identity and here's things we can do. And we've learned the lesson. The villain role is like, well, we don't care. We tried to cover it up. We didn't disclose it. So think about how you want to be perceived in those moments. But if you get hit again, the hero story becomes less available as an option.
Absolutely.
Hey, we got hit once. We've done everything we can for you. We've learned everything's gonna be better. Now there's an 81% chance you can get hit again. Are you ready? Like really ready? Because if you get hit again, are you gonna say the same thing again? Right. How about a third time? That's horrendous. And by the way, there's a reason why this happens, because there are affiliates. They have a supply chain. There are those who sell compromised systems to the gangs. So DarkSide or Conti or Our Evil's back, right? And they sell it to them. Then they come in with their ransomware and they take over. That affiliate, it's almost like a partner program for the dark side, then turns around and says, well, I could sell that victim because they were kind of stupid last time. And that's what I'm playing one on TV here. I'll sell it to the other ransomware gang. Mm-hmm. So even though the first ransomware gang is not going to come after you again, you're now an asset that can be sold like a lead to others. And that's exactly what happens. So keep in mind, it could be the gift that keeps on giving. Really improve and really make sure that you've got a good strategy in place, or your message platform will collapse.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we had this conversation, because these are some things that I've given a little bit of thought to and maybe have understood about 5% of what we actually talked about before having this conversation. So this was very illuminating for me. So thank you guys for sharing this. I'm glad I got to be a part of it. As we're wrapping up, do you guys have anything else that you want to touch on? I want to plug your guys' businesses, but is there any other points that you guys want to hit on before we wrap up?
No, let's just reiterate. So know your attack surface, right? Let's do basic IT principles, right? So ways to strategize and remediate and prevent these things from happening, because you want to stay in the prevention detection side. You don't want to be in the response and recovery side. You want to stay left of the boom, is what we call that. So make sure your house is in order, patch your systems, make sure you harden those systems. All these things that we're talking about, zero trust, let's make sure that we do those with the security controls we have now, and in place. Everyone just go back and re-review things. Go back and look, why did I set this policy? Don't make it be shelfware. Look through it. Look at your technology stack. Is there something better? Should I rip and replace it? How should I do this? How should we make this better? Just do those things. Those simple things can stop an attack, ransomware, because it's coming probably the same way for the last 20 years. So let's make sure I'll keep our house in order. That's what I have to say.
And educate your employees.
Okay.
Don't click things.
Don't click things.
And the other thing I would add is, if you're a security person out there, you really have to learn the language of the business if you haven't already. Yep. And if you're a business person out there, I have good news. Your skill set is the most relevant to this conversation. Mm-hmm. This is very similar to what has to be done to get integrity in manufacturing, in financial processes, in any number of business processes. And so I still think the biggest problem in security is that gap between the security people and the business people. Mm-hmm. And so please don't be intimidated by how arcane and esoteric our discipline seems. It's no more so than any others. And this can all be solved, and largely with an approach that is about business diligence and operations.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, so guys, where can people find you to learn more and start working with you?
Sure. You can reach out to us on the internet, info@inceptussecure.com. Inceptus is our company name, cybersecurity as a service, essentially.
Cool.
And I'm cybereason.com. Or reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to talk to people about this, or on Twitter, which I don't pay as much attention to, and other social media too.
Okay.
Probably for the betterment of your mental health, I'd say, avoiding Twitter.
Yeah, no doom scrolling through tweets.
Hey, Elon Musk is going to take care of Twitter.
Oh, I hear that. I hear he's taking care of all of that. So that's good.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you guys very much for joining me. This was a great conversation. So thank you again. And
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.